Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Krasnohorivka, west of the city of Donetsk. The Russians here have made significant advances northwest of the industrial area into the apartment complex areas here in the northern residential area of the central parts of the city. We see that both in the eastern parts and western parts of the city, the Russians have engaged the fighting into the apartment complexes, which are act as the final defensive line of the Ukrainians within the city. Following that, there's no defensive capabilities other than regular residential areas, which are very difficult to defend in comparison to industrial and apartment complex areas. So with this, the Russians are now fighting at the final line of defense. And to the east, the Ukrainian lines have completely collapsed. All of the fortifications have been left behind, and the Russians are now fighting within the apartment complex and school area in the eastern outskirts of the city. So with this, the Ukrainian lines east of the city and in the central parts of the city have collapsed, and the Russians are storming the final line of the Ukrainian defenses in the city before we see the Russians pushing through to the start of the end of the Battle of Krasnohorivka. Moving on, we see here in the direction of the north with the Russian Kharkiv offensive, further advances have been made in the northern parts and northeastern parts of the city in the Kharkiv region. We see to the north of the city, the Russians have managed to capture the villages of Morokhovets and Olenikove, as is shown in this geolocated footage of Russian troops moving on beyond the village against the Ukrainian positions by Hlyboke. It is clear that the Russians are moving through from the northern parts, central parts of the northern area, and from the direction of Streletsya towards Hlyboke. The Russians are looking to attack it head on directly from Streletsya and flanking it from the rear through Olenikove. The Russians are likely looking to gain control over the fortifications to the east and north of the village, in that sense allowing them to hit the Ukrainian positions from the rear and from the front at the same time in a pincer maneuver. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the frontline villages here in the northern section. This will allow the Russians to even out the front line along the river line to the west and through to the Russian border. And we see that the Russian advances here in the northeastern parts have been connected through the advance in between the two villages. So with this, we see that the Russians have now started pushing towards Staritsya to the north of Severodonetsk River, where they're looking to gain control of the river line here in the northern section. And in the eastern section, the Russians have pushed through, capturing Hatyshe, and have moved on to fight in Vovchansk. The main fighting is taking place within the village of Vovchansk, which has direct rail connection, which is why it is the main defensive position of the Ukrainians in the area. We also see that the village itself is a large town. This allows the Ukrainians to have a significant presence within it, but at the same time, the heavy Russian bombardment of it makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to continue the fights here. It is reported that the Russians are putting much of their effort into the Battle of Vovchansk because gaining control of that village will allow the Russians to then move on to the next Ukrainian line of defense. The Ukrainians here in this section of the front line have one regular line of defense here beyond that of Vovchansk, which goes something like this. Here in the northern parts of the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, we see the Ukrainian defensive line with this Twitter post here, where the Ukrainian lines are located here east of the Severodonetsk River, as I just drew out. The white lines are anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth that are built by the Ukrainians, and the yellow lines are trenches that the Ukrainians use as fortified areas. So we see Vovchansk here in the north where the fighting is taking place, the main fighting. Beyond that, there is this defensive line here to the east. Drawing it out, it is pretty much alongside the road here between the Vorishne to the Ukrainian positions by the Severodonetsk River to the northwest. This means this area right here is where the fortifications are centered around, both with the anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth. This is why it's likely when the Russians fight over Vovchansk and push through it, they'll likely look to gain control over the roads here to the north to cut off the entire northern section from the Ukrainian positions and gain control of it before fighting through the Ukrainian line of defense. They could also be looking to break through the Ukrainian lines quickly by concentrating their forces by pushing through both of the east and the west to push through in the central parts by the highway and down south towards the Vorishne and the western parts by the Severodonetsk River. It is clear based on the current trend that the Russian operations will be focused around the east of the Severodonetsk River and east of Kharkiv. And based on the current developments, it is also likely that the Russians will enter from the eastern parts, expanding the front line in the Kharkiv region even further. This will allow the Russians to start an operation where they'll be pushing in a downward direction both from the east and from the west towards the highway from both directions, down to the Vorishne in the southeast, and pushing towards the Severodonetsk River in the southwest. And then the Russians will be looking to regain control over the areas that they lost during the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive, where fighting will be reaching Kupiansk in the east, Shevchovne and Balaklia in the west, before moving down south to Izium in the south. This would mean that the Russians would be pushing down south from this direction in a spiral where they continue in the eastern and western direction, hitting the flanks and going down in depth. The reason that this is a possibility for the Russians is they have the Severodonetsk River here to the west, where they gain control over the northern parts along the forest patches to create a strong flank in the north. And having the front line along the Severodonetsk River will protect the western flank, similar to the period of time prior to the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive. So the Russians would look to gain a front line along the Izium direction, up north towards Balaklia, and connecting that with Wolochev Yar to Chuhiev here in the west, along the Severodonetsk River, and gaining control over everything east of this. Going down along the Oskar River line will also cut off the Ukrainian positions east of it, alongside the Oskar River line and in the direction of Liman. This will allow the Russians to gain control over the northern flank of Sloviansk. Combining this with an offensive operation by the Russians towards the Krasnohorivka from the south through Avdiivka and west of Donetsk towards Pokrovsk, the Russians would be threatening every major population center in the Donetsk region and look to gain full control of it. So an offensive in the Kharkiv region could be directly in support of the Russian efforts in the Donetsk region. There's also the possibility that this is only the start of the operations and that they will significantly expand this to the entire front. But what we'll see is, depending on the next few days and weeks, how much success the Russians will face, how strong the Ukrainian defenses are, how many reserves they're willing to dedicate to this section of the front line, and so on. This could end up as a stalemate by the front line if the Ukrainians send enough troops, but that would put a danger into the Donetsk region and could start a collapse of the front, similar to what we're seeing in the direction of Krasnohorivka. If the Russians gain control of that, then the fighting will move on to Selidove, here west of Donetsk. Taking Selidove would mean the fighting reaches Pokrovsk. So we're seeing that the situation could significantly develop quickly if the Ukrainians move too many troops to the Kharkiv region. There are reports that the Ukrainians are moving troops from the Kherson region, which would mean that the Russians would start recapturing positions along the Dnieper River line, the Battle of Krinky would end, and the Russian units themselves will also be freed from the Kherson region, which would allow the Russians to then strengthen other positions across the front. So no matter what decision the Ukrainians make to try and help defend the eastern parts, they'll end up in a weaker position elsewhere. They have reserves that they could send, but even sending the reserves would mean that if the Russians open another front in the Sumy region or Chernihiv region, that the Ukrainians would have nothing to respond with. So the question here is, how many troops does the Ukrainian actually have, and how much equipment do they have available to arm those troops, while the Russians are able to launch this offensive here in the Kharkiv region, showing that they at the very least have the capacity to launch and expand the front line. This allows Russians to gain this advantage right now, which is that they have the initiative with the majority of their forces not being committed yet, so the Ukrainians do not know should they send more or not, and the ability to hold the front line is very significant for the Ukrainians right now to slow down the Russians and allow them to move around the troops as necessary. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.